Yes, welcome everyone. Good evening. So in third session, we are going to cover these topics. So let's start with the first one. It's chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases. So we'll go for page number 391. Okay, so this chronic obstructive pulmonary diseases, actually we have two type of main diseases which basically constitute this single disease, which termed as chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So these two diseases are called as emphysema and this chronic bronchitis. And mostly questions are based on, you're not going to, they are not going to ask you specifically about chronic bronchitis or emphysema, but yes, as a whole, you should know what is the basic pathophysiology, and mostly questions are based on pathophysiology. So for emphysema, if we are considering, so it's a terminal airway destructing, resulting in decreased elastic recoil of lungs. So there will be decrease in the elastic recoilness of the lung. And why is that so? Because of the terminal airway destruction. So the first thing we should have in our mind is that this COPD is actually an airflow obstruction. And that may be because of the bronchitis, that may be because of the emphysema. So if we are considering emphysema, there should be pathophysiology which should be in our mind, that is terminal airway destruction. But if we are considering chronic bronchitis, the pathophysiology is totally changed. There the presentation is like, okay, let me turn on it. Okay. So if you are considering chronic bronchitis, there has to be a productive cough which is more than 3 months per year. That's very important for a recall point of view. They're asking usually this question, that for how many months the patient is experiencing. So it should be more than 3 months per year and 2 consecutive years. So say for example, if the patient is coming to who's having just a history of 10 or 12 days history of this productive cough, or maybe less than 1 month or maybe 2 months, but it's not consecutively for 2 years. You cannot, lie that patient under chronic bronchitis. So for making a diagnosis of chronic bronchitis, it should be more than 3 months per year and for 2 consecutive years. So then only we can say it's a chronic bronchitis. Anyhow, in both of these cases, what we will see there will be decrease in forced expiratory volume in 1 second and forced vital capacity. And overall, we will see there will be increase in total lung capacity because it's a airflow obstruction. So the airway, whatever the air is there, it will get trapped there. So what do we mean by FEV1? FEV1 is actually the amount of air you can force from your lungs in 1 second. You have to, say for example, when we are asking for spirometry, what we actually ask from the patient, we ask from the patient that please exhale, and whatever the amount or volume of air he is exhaling in 1 second, we will consider that amount of air as a forced expiratory volume 1, that is 1 second. And what do we mean by FVC? FVC is forced vital capacity. So see, there is a difference between vital capacity and forced vital capacity. So forced vital capacity, as the term indicates, based on forceful expiration. You are going to see the total amount of volume of air exhaled with maximal force of effort. So when we are considering maximal force of effort, we will say it's a forced vital capacity. But if you say only the amount of volume that is exhaled with, for a minimal or maximal inspiration, so that is called vital capacity. So here we are not considering vital capacity. Vital capacity anyhow will be decreased. Here we are going to check the ratio, and ratio is calculated when normal, this forced vital capacity to this forced expiratory volume is actually 70% in normal cases. But always when we are considering COPD, it should be less than 70%. So it's written 0.7. So if it's written less than 0.7%, always think about this COPD. So that's a clear-cut diagnosis of this one. So what we will see the total lung capacity, overall the total lung capacity will be increased, but the ratio of this forced expiratory volume and this forced vital capacity will be decreased. Of course, the patient is having airflow obstruction. He is not going to, exhale so much amount of volume of air that a normal person should do usually. So the overall, the ratio of this forced expiratory volume in 1 second and forced vital capacity will be decreased, but the total lung capacity will be increased because you will find lots of amounts of air that is trapped inside the lungs. So etiology we should know. It's for both actually emphysema and chronic bronchitis. Of course, the most important one is tobacco smoking, we will see. And here, because it's an elastic recoil of the lung is decreased, we can also see this one. So see, again, yeah, there is one recoil which is very common here. They usually ask about the old patients and the young patient. So it's not only about the old patient and young patient, it's about the smoking history. So always look in the question, in the history, that the patient is old and patient is smoker, or the patient is young and the patient is non-smoker. So the smoking should be there or should not be there in making, in order to make the exact etiology of the disease. So if the question says the patient is old and the patient is a smoker, then always think this tobacco smoking is the main reason. But if the question says the young person who is a non-smoker, then you can think of any other thing. And what is that thing? Is actually the enzyme deficiency, alpha-1 antitrypsin. This enzyme, once this enzyme is deficient, this enzyme is responsible to maintain the formation of this elastin fiber. So once this enzyme is deficient, this elastin fibers will get destroyed, and that's why the disease. So etiology will be the same. The elastin fibers are not going to work properly, but whether it's because of the tobacco smoking or it's because of the genetic deficiency of this alpha trypsin enzyme. So if the person is young, the person is non-smoker, ultimately it should be in your mind that it's enzyme deficiency, maybe because of the enzyme, because there is no history of tobacco smoking. And the patient is old, patient is a smoker, so you will always think about tobacco smoking. So this question is very important. Then we have this presentation. There will be shortness of breath. We will see intermittent exacerbation. The cough will be increased. Of course, the air trapping will be there. The air trapping is increased. That's why the total lung capacity, overall total lung capacity increase. You will always find on examination barrel chest here. So now again, this testing is very important for our exam point of view. You should know the best initial test. You should know the most accurate test. So best initial test will always be the chest X-ray, because in chest X-ray you can easily see the air is trapped inside, and there will be the flattening of the diaphragm because of the trapping of air inside the lungs. So you will just see this on the basis of chest X-ray, you can easily distinguish. So that should be the best initial. And for the most accurate test, we will go for this pulmonary function test. So in pulmonary function test, if it says decrease FEV1 to FEV ratio, we will see it should be less than 70%, because normally 70%. But here in this case, because of the damage to the recoil of the elastin fiber, there's more trapping of the air inside, we will see this decreased FEV1 to FEV ratio. And of course, we will check here this decreased DLC, this diffusion lung capacity for carbon monoxide. See, this carbon monoxide, although it's a very dangerous thing, and it has 230 times faster accuracy in combining with oxygen as compared to hemoglobin. But here in this case, we are using carbon monoxide. Why? Just to get an information that whether the air is going to, is going to be taken or transferred from the lungs into the tissues. So the proper delivery is there or not. Because if there's something damage in the elastin fiber, or there's something trapping of the air inside the lungs, this carbon monoxide will not be transferred from the lungs to the oxygen. Especially to the hemoglobin. So this carbon monoxide is competing with the oxygen actually, and it's 230 times more faster as compared to oxygen. So what we will do here in this diffusion lung capacity, if we are checking for carbon monoxide, is just the test to simply know whether air is transferred from lungs into the blood. And how we will check that? We will just allow this carbon monoxide into the patient's body. So we will see whether the carbon monoxide level is increased or not. So if it's not increased, it's showing that it must be trapped inside the lung. It's not going to the tissues through blood, because it should be combined with hemoglobin, but it's not combining with hemoglobin. Why? Because it's get trapped inside the lungs. So that is how we can see. So there will be decreased diffusion lung capacity of carbon monoxide. Otherwise, this carbon monoxide is very fast in diffusing. So this is just a test for checking this one. Okay, so then we have this. It's okay, there's nothing too much related to your this one. This arterial blood gases, ABGs, of course we can always see for the carbon dioxide level. We can see this oxygen level combining capacity with the hemoglobin. We can go for the ECG testing, but that is not very much suggestive. Echocardiography, again, if we can see right ventricular hypertrophy, pulmonary hypertension, then again it's an advanced disease, we can think of this one, but for diagnostic point of view it has no significance. For the treatment option, what we will see here, improve mortality and delays progression of disease. So what we can do here, we will just ask the patient to go for the smoking cessation, because the main reason is smoking, and smoking can reverse the situation all over. So we will ask for this one. Oxygen therapy, if there is too much hypoxia, we will of course going to ask for this oxygen therapy. So it's not going to be here very effective. Treatment, so treatment is going to be supportive in the case, like you will ask for the supportive treatment for the smoking cessation, you will go for the oxygen therapy. Yes, here. Okay, now again this one. So definitely improve symptoms, but does not decrease disease progression. So only the exacerbation, only when you are going to cure the symptoms, acute symptoms, we can go for short-acting beta agonists. But the very important point here again for our exam or recall point of view, they are usually asking which is the most effective treatment in COPD. We know very well whether the patient is COPD patient or the patient is having this emphysema or chronic bronchitis, or even the patient is asthmatic. In all of these circumstances, we'll just offer, first thing is albuterol. First thing always should be the short-acting beta agonist. But when the question is says initial treatment, then only you will choose this beta agonist. When the question is asking you what is the most, which one is considered to be the most effective treatment for COPD, so the maximal benefit always we will have in this patients, especially of COPD patient, those who are taking inhaled anticholinergics. So that is a very important point for a recall's point of view. If they're asking the best initial treatment, or only not, don't say best, only the initial treatment. So initial treatment, of course, in any case, whether it's asthmatic, whether emphysema, whether chronic bronchitis, we will always go for short-acting beta agonist, and that is albuterol. Very common. But if the question is asking you the most effective treatment, so effective treatment in any case, whether it's a COPD or whether it's an asthmatic, which is not actually controlled on albuterol, we will always consider this inhaled anticholinergics. So please remember anticholinergics in that scenario. And again, if it's not controlled, you will go for inhaled steroids. Not controlled, you can go for long-acting beta agonists. So these are step-up medication, but always starting with the short beta agonist. Then consider the most effective one, that is inhaled anticholinergics. Yes. Okay, and then okay, so the next thing which is very important here is actually the acute exacerbation. So when the patient is presenting with the acute exacerbation, and that should not be.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, sure.
Can you please differentiate between muscarinic, cholinergic, and beta receptors in the lungs?
Sorry, come again.
Just explain the muscarinic, cholinergic, and beta receptors in the lungs.
Okay.
Differentiate between.
Yeah, so let us finish with this one, and then I will explain these two. Okay, all these. Is it fine with you? Just finish with this topic, yeah.
Okay.
So otherwise, we will go and this first question will take a lot of time. So I will explain you this.
No, but it is the question, na?
Yes. Don't worry. I will explain you. So first, just let's finish this one because it's almost finished. So see this here, we will. So once the question is asking you about the exacerbation, and that exacerbation is not only mild, it's very moderate or severe exacerbation. And how you will see the patient is showing you the moderate symptoms or the severe symptoms. There must be too much difficulty in breathing, of course. There will be too much sputum production. So there how you will say, okay, it's a moderate or it's a severe disease, or whether it's a need of hospitalization or not. In all those cases where it says moderate to severe, or if the question doesn't say something like that, like you're not getting this one, that's it's a severe symptom or it's a moderate symptom, then just look for the presentation, like look for the landing of the patient. It should be in the emergency department. So you can think, okay, it's a moderate disease or it's a severe disease. So where we will consider this antibiotics. But antibiotics, again, both etiologies are there. So viruses are also there and bacteria is also there. So most commonly three things are there. If you are considering bacteria, then streptococcus is the majority of the time is the most important cause of this one. And then we have virus also, this H. influenzae and Moraxia catarrhalis. So these are the three actually things. When you go for the cultures, you will get to know whether it's a virus or it's a bacteria. But overall, we have to start antibiotic. in acute exacerbation condition, whether it's a moderate or severe one. So we will go for this macrolide cephalosporin. Usually I haven't seen question like this one where they're asking for the best antibiotic or whatever there, but we should know that we have to give antibiotic in the cases where there is acute exacerbation, especially in a case of moderate to severe COPD. First line. Second line, we have different doxycycline, but again, we are not going to memorize all this one, but we should know that antibiotic should be given against cover of this one, Streptococcus pneumonia, and we are considering virus also, this influenza.
Doctor, we should give all acute exacerbations or where there are infections.
See, if there is infection, there will be exacerbation, of course. So once the patient is there with the sputum production, more and more sputum production, if the sputum production is too much, he cannot breathe. So of course, we will consider antibiotics, first IV antibiotics, because when there is infection, there will be exacerbation. So antibiotic only consider in the case of exacerbation, when the patient is landing in an emergency department, when he's having too much difficulty in breathing because of the this productive cough. Too much productive cough. It's keep on continuing choking the respiration. Okay. So we'll just go to the questions. Yeah. Sorry. Okay. So based on our this topic, we will just solve these important recalls, recent recalls. Which of the following term best describe terminal airway destruction resulting in decreased elastic recall of the lung? So it's a very straight question. We will just look for the which of the following terms is best suited. So terminal airway destruction, there will be elasticity of the recoil, which is going to be decreased. So what do you think? It's a chronic bronchitis, it's emphysema, it's a bronchiectasis. Now you have two choices. So how you are going to differentiate between emphysema and bronchitis? I know you can easily differentiate between bronchiectasis and bronchiolitis. Bronchiolitis is a surgical emergency. This bronchiectasis presentation should be there in order to make a diagnosis of bronchiolitis. Similarly, bronchiectasis, there should be a history of any surgical operation. Soon after operation, the patient is having experiencing this bronchiectasis. So based on these simple things, what you're going to say, whether it's emphysema or chronic bronchitis. Anyone?
Emphysema.
How emphysema? Why not chronic bronchitis? Because again, chronic bronchitis is based on the symptoms. It's not based on the histology. It's based on the symptomatic pathophysiology. There should be cough. There should be something, in order to make a diagnosis. But emphysema, definitely it's a histological. For emphysema, there should be a histological evidence, and here it's clearly mentioned terminal airway destruction. Yeah, see, there are diseases where we have to see whether we can make the diagnosis just simply by the history, whether we can make the diagnosis by doing physical examination, whether we can make the diagnosis until and unless we have any histological evidence, or whether we can make a diagnosis when we just go for the clinical symptoms, clinical presentation of the patient. So we have to always, when you're covering any topic, just think about this one, how we are going to make the diagnosis of this patient based on the history only, based on the clinical symptoms, based on the physical findings, based on the pathophysiology, based on the histology. So histology and pathophysiology comes together. So this emphysema is always, diagnosis is always based on histopathology. So which is this one, terminal airway destruction. So this is the case of emphysema.
Dr. Hira, the emphysema is mentioned in the notes as well.
What do you mean by notes? These handouts? Yes. Yes. We just now covered that. I think you joined late. We just covered this one. See, it's starting from here. It's clearly mentioned emphysema. See this one. Or if you cannot find this, these are handouts in MTB. It's more in detail, but you can find the same thing here.
Thank you.
Mentioned here. Yeah. Okay. The next question: which of the following statement best describe chronic bronchitis? You remember chronic bronchitis? More than 3 months, less than 3 months for 2 consecutive, or only 3 months or more than 3 months? What do you will say?
A, more than 3 months for 2 years.
More than 3 months.
3 months for 2 years.
So it should be A. So Okay, which of the following is the most likely cause of COPD in young and non-smoker? So see, there's a scenario of this one, but actually the doctor forgot the whole scenario. But she gave me the
Alpha
main
196.
clue. Yeah, that the patient was young, the age was something below 20, and of course he's a non-smoker. So you will go for
One inhibition.
enzyme deficiency, exactly. Or if the case is something like that, if the patient is this one, old age and smoker, then what you're going to choose?
Tobacco.
Tobacco.
COPD.
Exactly, tobacco.
Tobacco.
Okay. Now the next one, which of the following is the best initial test to diagnose COPD? So best initial, most accurate. You have to always memorize this one. So here,
X-ray.
what you're going to choose?
Just X-ray.
Yeah, which of the following is the best initial? Chest X-ray, because chest X-ray will be very obvious. There will be flattening of the diaphragm. You can easily see the air trapped inside the lungs. That is considered to be the best initial. And what is the most accurate? Remember?
PFTs.
PFTs.
Pulmonary function test. Exactly. Now, which of the following is considered to be most effective treatment of COPD? Most effective. They are not asking you the initial one. They are not asking you any exacerbation thing or something.
Anticholinergics.
Anticholinergics. And if they ask you only this one, initial treatment, then initial, not the best initial treatment. So we'll go for albuterol. And someone who is not even responding on anticholinergic, we will just add this one, inhaled steroids, and again step we can go for long-acting beta-agonist. So you should know this one.
Okay. Most effective is anticholinergic.
Just give me a second. Okay. So the next question is, a 38-year-old man who is a smoker for several years present. This we have to do or? Yeah, I think. So a 38-year-old man who is a smoker for several years present to the clinic with progressive shortness of breath, pulmonary function test done which result in the following parameters. Forced expiratory volume and forced vital capacity is less than 0.7. That is 70% less than 70% with minimal improvement after bronchodilators. Low diffusing capacity for carbon monoxide. So DLCO is low. Forced vital capacity, FeV1 to FVC is low. No, it's not PVC, is actually miss. So which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? What do you think is this one? Emphysema, bronchial asthma, chronic bronchitis, or interstitial lung disease?
Chronic bronchitis.
Interstitial lung disease.
Emphysema.
Yeah, see, ideally the answer should be COPD, because only on the basis of this one we cannot say this one. But who is a smoker for several years due to clinic with progressive shortness of breath? There is nothing mentioned here like he's having productive cough which is occurring for more than 3 months for the 2 consecutive years, because ideally the answer should be COPD. But if you have to choose in between emphysema and COPD, in between emphysema and chronic bronchitis, then you will choose on the histological basis emphysema and on the presentation basis chronic bronchitis, right? So there is nothing mentioned something about productive cough for how many months, for 2 consecutive, whether for 2 consecutive years or not. Just only mentioned that the patient is having progressive shortness of breath, patient is having all this PFT, because this PFT is the same in the chronic bronchitis and same in emphysema, right? There is no distinguishing factors between two. Only we are going to make a diagnosis on the basis of histology and on the basis of clinical presentation. So here, because of the basis of histology, and we don't have any clinical presentation mentioned here, like productive cough for more than 3 months for 2 consecutive years, so we have to choose emphysema. Otherwise, if the sensible answer should be COPD, right, where we don't have to discriminate between emphysema and chronic bronchitis. Are you getting me? Maybe you don't have any option of this chronic bronchitis.
Not interstitial lung disease.
Interstitial lung disease is a very, very broad term, very vague term. There, most of the time, you will not see this FEV and FEVC. We will not bother about this one. We just go for the pulmonary function testing. We are and DLCO, this diffusion lung capacity, the carbon monoxide, this FEV1 FEVC ratio, this DLCO are more, are more pathognomonic for COPDs, not for the whole interstitial lung disease, because interstitial lung disease can be any, can be fibrosis, can be COPD, can be asthma. It's a very broad term. You have to minimize, narrow. You should narrow down, taper down to make a diagnosis. So these tests are very particular tests. Are not the tests which will give you on a broad term. See, so you cannot say interstitial lung because it will be very.
If they have given us a history of
history of
if they have given us the history for more than 3 months or 2 consecutive
years,
then
then you should go for chronic bronchitis. Yes.
Okay.
Based on the presentation. Here you will choose based on the presentation. Yes. So here again,
are you sure these are the right? These are the right answers, the right questions?
Yes. The question may be broken questions, but the theme is there. So don't worry. I spent much of time. We did 101 session to have only collection of these questions. So don't worry. But of course, you're not going to get the same questions, but at least you should have an idea how to solve these questions. Okay, the next one is a 50-year-old man presents to the clinic with chronic history of productive cough and shortness of breath. A diagnosis of COPD is suspected. So already you have a diagnosis in your hand. PFTs is ordered. Which of the following pulmonary function tests is most likely to represent COPD? So you are only suspecting COPD just now based on the symptoms, based on the presentation. Now, what you are going to get in your test result in order to confirm the diagnosis of COPD? So anyone remember this one? There should be, if we considering the ratio of this FEV1 to FEV, so it should be less than 0.7. The total lung capacity, of course, will be increased because of the attractment of too much air inside. That will lead to barrel chest, and of course, the vital capacity is decreased. Yes. So increase total lung capacity, decrease vital capacity, decrease. So of course, these two should be decreased. And total lung capacity. Second is increased TLC, decreased vital capacity, increase. So this cannot be increased. Here, vital capacity cannot be increased, and here, vital capacity cannot be normal, right? So the first one is correct. Okay. So for next question, we have to go for the theory. Okay, next we have, sorry, Dr. Tahira, what was your question about the receptors?
Dr. Tahira, your voice is breaking down. Your voice is breaking down.
Voice is breaking down. Okay, all of you have the same problem? All of you are not getting my voice?
No, we can hear you.
Okay.
My question was, can you please explain me the this beta receptors, muscarinic?
Dr. Tahira, we cannot hear you. Dr. Tahira. What I suggest to Dr. Tahira, if you could just leave the session and join again, because we cannot hear you here.
Okay.
So I think we should wait for her. Yes, Dr. Thyra. It's better now?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Okay, so your question is, what are the function of this muscarinic receptors or beta-adrenergic receptors on lungs, right?
Yeah, muscarinic, beta-adrenergic, and anticholinergic. Little explanation for me.
Yeah. Okay, okay. See, these receptors are all over the lung. So, say for example, if we are considering the first one, this muscarinic receptors, so they are very, very prominent in different parts of the lungs. You can see, especially on the bronchus. So, the main point of these muscarinic receptors is this one, that they are involved in bronchoconstriction and mucus secretion. So, say for example, if someone is coming from outside and it's going to act on muscarinic receptor, what will happen? There will be a breakdown of one protein. I think it's a phosphoinositides. And what will they do? They will do the release of calcium, and there will be constriction. There will be bronchoconstriction. So, in simple words, you can say that whenever there is an activation of muscarinic receptor, there will always be a bronchoconstriction, and mucus is always secreted. Are you getting me? So if someone is muscarinic agonist, if some drug is muscarinic agonist, it means that it is straight away going to the bronchus. It will ask the bronchus to constrict. It will ask the bronchus to secrete mucus. Okay. Or if some drug is muscarinic antagonist, it means that it is going to go on bronchus. It will ask bronchus to please stop constriction and don't secrete mucus. So simple is that. So muscarinic is responsible for bronchoconstriction and mucus secretion. This is about muscarinic. Okay, and it's present all over in lungs. You cannot easily differentiate, but mostly bronchial sites. So bronchus, maybe primary bronchus, maybe secondary bronchus, maybe tertiary bronchus, maybe even terminal bronchioles. Now your second is this one, especially this adrenergic receptor. This adrenergic receptor, or you're saying this cholinergic receptor. So again, they are there, but they are responsible for the activation of this pump. You remember that pump, sodium transport pump, which is actually responsible for the clearance of excess amount of fluid from the alveolar spaces. There is a surface tension inside the alveoli, which make them, which make them always to open, because when there is RDS in newborn babies, what is there? There is a deficiency of surfactant, right? That's why they have lots of amount of surface tension, and the baby, those who are having RDS, they cannot actually decrease that surface tension, and ultimately there will be collapse of the bronchioles. So there will be no oxygen inside the lungs. So similarly here, so these adrenergic receptors, these cholinergic receptors, they are responsible to act on this sodium transport system, and they are responsible for the clearance of excessive fluid of alveolar air spaces. So thereby they are maintaining the surface tension. Yeah, cholinergic. Yeah, or you can say adrenergic. So adrenergic or cholinergic, they are actually responsible to maintain the surface tension. Yes, surface tension. So if anyone who is beta adrenergic agonist, it's going to help the alveoli in the tongues to maintain the surface tension, so that alveoli keep on getting, removing their excessive fluid, keep on opening. They will not collapse. They will not get collapsed, right? Or if someone is antagonist, so of course it's going to get, it will collapse all the alveoli.
Energy. Okay. Thank you. And the
That's
third
the main difference. And what is the third one?
Beta.
So beta is the one, beta adrenergic or beta cholinergic. Beta and alpha, these are the two types. So beta are mostly for the lungs activity. So alpha and beta are the types. But beta, you have to say for beta adrenergic agonist or antagonist. That's the same thing.
And alpha and beta, they're
alpha are mostly for the vessels. Alpha receptors are mostly present on the vessels, and beta are especially on bronchus. We are considering the receptor site is this alpha and beta are basically based on the location where they are located. So whenever it comes to alpha,
beta cholinergic, we can call them beta cholinergic.
We can call beta cholinergic, or you can call adrenergic. Means the same thing.
Okay.
There is no difference here.
But these medicines are different. Beta LABA and this anticholinergic medicines are different.
Yeah, see, because they are going to, the differences is actually based on the site. So those who are acting on the vessels, mostly they are adrenergic. and they are alpha adrenergic antagonists. And those who are acting on the bronchus, we will say this especially beta adrenergic agonist or beta adrenergic antagonist. So mostly for the lungs, just remember adrenergic. Don't bother yourself for cholinergic. Cholinergic for the smooth muscles of the lungs, like smooth muscles of the bronchi, small muscles. But don't think about that. If you're considering interstitial lung diseases, think about bronchus, think about adrenergic beta adrenergic, or maybe muscarinic, because you are more into seeing the constriction, dilatation, and mucus secretion.
Because we were saying what is the most appropriate best treatment for COPD was anticholinergic.
Yes, these anticholinergic. Yes. So why anticholinergic? Because say anticholinergic or antiadrenergic means the same thing. They are going to help to maintain the surface tension inside the alveoli. So they will keep open it. Because you remember the pathophysiology of emphysema, those are responsible to destroy the elastic recoil of the lung.
Yeah.
So that can be inhibited if you just inhibit the surface tension with the help of this adrenergic receptors agonist.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So now we will move to this irritable bowel syndrome, page number 140. So here we have irritable bowel syndrome. Yeah, irritable bowel syndrome. So for irritable bowel syndrome, what we are going to see, mostly again the questions which we are having on this irritable bowel syndrome, they are mostly on the presentation point of view. Say for example, if the patient is having diarrhea and constipation, alternately the patient is having pain in the abdomen, and once there is constipation, the other time there is diarrhea. So relieved by bowel movement. So whenever the pain is there, that pain should be relieved by bowel movement, whether it's a constipated stool or it's a loose stool. But there will be no pain at night. So that's a very important presentation here in case of irritable bowel syndrome. So no specific diagnosis, only just based on the symptoms, based on the history of the patient, whatever the patient is telling you, you can easily decide whether it's irritable bowel syndrome or not. So you will just ask your patient to take more fiber and antispasmodic agents. You can ask for the tricyclic antidepressant, but all these therapies are just a supportive therapy. There is no particular or exclusive therapy for these type of patients. Inflammatory bowel, we will do it later. Just go for the MCQ first. So here the question says, a 30-year-old man with 3 years history of intermittent abdominal pain, bloating and diarrhea seen in the clinic, which of the following complaints are highly suggestive of irritable bowel syndrome? Now we already have a diagnosis in our hand. Only it states irritable bowel syndrome. You just need to choose the presentation of the patient. What should be the presentation? It's a diarrhea that alternate with constipation, or the patient is going to say to you that I have undiagnosed food particles in the stool, or blood streak mixed with stool, or diarrhea at night. So always remember, in terms of irritable bowel syndrome, there will be less symptoms at night. At night, the patient is not going to complain anything about. It should be alternative diarrhea and constipation. There should be some history of diarrhea and constipation. Sometimes I have loose stool, sometimes I have constipation, but whether the pain is there, when I go to washroom, it's relieved. Whether it's constipated or diarrhea comes, but it's relieved. The pain is relieved. So on the basis of symptoms, what you're going to choose here?
Diarrhea with alternate constipation.
Diarrhea with alternate. Okay, I think the next question also. A 20-year-old man with 4 months history of non-specific crampy abdominal pain and diarrhea alternate with constipation. Here the history is very suggestive. That is not related to any specific food. It's good they have mentioned like this, because other than that, we can always think about celiac disease also, because sometimes it's very difficult to differentiate between celiac disease. But then we have to ask from the patient, especially if you have any food allergy and after taking some specific food you are having this problem. So history here comes, history is very important here. So he has no history of food allergy. So it's again very clear. No history of weight loss, blood pressure is okay, heart rate, everything is okay. Which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? So here again, the question is saying related to history. So history suggestive of alternate things. So you're going to choose. So look for the answer choices as well. And then you will go for irritable bowel syndrome. So for lactose intolerance, there should be a history of like when the patient is having any, often milk containing substances, the patient is experiencing this symptom. So it can pointing you towards lactose intolerance. Colonic cancer and Crohn's disease. Crohn's disease again it's an inflammatory bowel disease. We can see abdominal pain here, but there are certain other things in order to make a diagnosis of Crohn's disease. Some other pathophysiology, some testing should be done. But here everything is normal. There is nothing in specific. So we have to go for irritable bowel syndrome.
Can the lactose tolerance happen in 20-year-old men?
Lactose intolerance, there should be a history of substances that has lactose. Say for example, milk containing some sugar.
A 20-year-old man can has lactose intolerance.
Less likely. It should, when someone is having lactose intolerance, it's diagnosed very early in infancy, like the baby who are just finished their breastfeeding, like 6-month-old, 7-month-old, 8 months old. They are usually very prone to lactose.
That's my question.
Yeah. Okay. So for the next one, we should go for the theory first. So now we will do this GERD quickly, page number 131. Okay, so this gastroesophageal reflux disorder, again, the presentation is very important here. The symptoms are very important, and we have to know the best initial test and the most accurate test for answering the questions. So here, what is the main pathophysiology? Pathophysiology is inappropriate relaxation of lower esophageal sphincter. So just memorize this one. Lower esophageal sphincter, of course, there is inappropriate relaxation. So when there is inappropriate relaxation, what will happen? A sphincter should be relaxed in order to propel the food from up to down. So there should be the propulsive movement should be from esophagus to stomach and then to the small intestine. But what happens if there is inappropriate relaxation? The stomach content will go back into the esophagus, and it will cause acidity of the esophagus, because esophagus is actually comprised of 3 portions: upper 1/3, middle 1/3, and the lower 1/3. So upper 1/3 is purely skeletal muscles. Whatever you can take, you can just throw out. Because of the skeletal muscle, you have voluntary control, you can just spit it out. But once it goes into the middle part of the esophagus, again it's composed of some skeletal parts, some smooth muscle parts. So again, you can, once you do ratching or some pinching inside the throat, you can still vomit. Like those who are doing this in the case of bulimia nervosa, they keep on poking their fingers in the throat and they keep on vomiting. And third one, the last portion of the esophagus is actually purely smooth muscle, and because of the smooth muscle and the pH is almost basic side. So what will happen if there is inappropriate relaxation of the lower esophageal sphincter? The content of the stomach will go back again into the esophagus. There will be regurgitation, and this esophagus, whose basic pH, when the content of the stomach, which is having pH of 1.2, highly acidic, it will get irritated and it will cause GERD. So long standing if there, it can cause Barrett esophagus and then cause adenocarcinoma of the esophagus. But it will take time to convert GERD into Barrett esophagus and Barrett esophagus into adenocarcinoma. This is very important to recall. That after how many years a Barrett esophagus can be converted into adenocarcinoma. So 10 years, approximately after 10 years, if there's long-standing Barrett esophagus, if there's long-standing GERD, you are not going to give any treatment to your patient is not receiving any medication, the GERD can be converted into Barrett and Barrett can be converted to adenocarcinoma, and 10 years only time difference is there from converting Barrett into adenocarcinoma. So here the patient will complain typically of heartburning, there will be metallic taste, there will be coughing. There is no unique physical finding in GERD. It is symptom complex. So here you will see most often diagnosed now. Again, the very important for our recall point of view, this 24-hour pH monitoring is considered to be the most accurate test. Most accurate test will be 24-hour pH monitoring. You can just do that. So must memorize this one. Otherwise, we can go for the endoscopy, but there are certain indications for endoscopy. Endoscopy always when the patient is too much difficulty in having food, you can see the weight loss in your patient. These are all the alarming symptoms for endoscopy. If the patient is having anemia and if there are long-standing symptoms of a patient, so we'll always go for endoscopy. So endoscopy will show nothing when there is only heartburning, when only there is pyrosis. So there should be, so endoscopy is okay, we can go for that, but it's not going to add much value to your diagnosis, especially in case of GERD. So what you are going to advise to your patient, you will always ask for the lifestyle modification, lifestyle changes. You will ask them to lose weight, avoid alcohol, and you can give them antacids or H2 receptor blocker or PPI for 4 to 6 weeks for erosive esophagitis. Again, they are not very much a specific treatment, but we will ask them first of all for the dietary advice, for the lifestyle advice. Then you can go for the H2 blocker, and then you can go for the PPIs. So PPIs are very much indicated in peptic ulcer disease, but not in case of GERD. For GERD, we will always start with the supportive therapy. 5% will not respond to PPI. So PPI is a last resort, and of course, a very good option. Sometimes patients are not responding to PPIs as well. So on those patients, you can go for surgical tightening of this lower esophageal sphincter. And this Nissen fundoplication is the most common method for surgical method for tightening of this lower esophageal sphincter. So there's a recall also. I cannot get the recall this one because it's the last year recall. But Nissen fundoplication is the technique. Remember this one. We have to use this one only in the case when PPIs are not working. So you will start with the supportive measures, then you go for the H2 receptor, then you go for the PPI. Nothing is working, then only go for the Nissen fundoplication. So if we just go to the questions here. A 34-year-old woman presents sitting seek history of retrosternal burning pain. Retrosternal burning pain, very suggestive. The pain is often worse following eating. Her past medical history include depression, and she is on escitalopram 10 mg/OD. Clinical examination is unremarkable. Which of the following is the most likely diagnosis? So what do you think? She's having this retrosternal burning, and the pain is often worse following eating. Dysphagia is there, retrosternal burning is there, history of taking of this antidepressant is there. So what do you think? It's pericarditis, pneumothorax, myocardial infarction. So pericarditis, pneumothorax. Yeah, it's a clear-cut diagnosis, but how you're going to rule out this pericarditis? For pericarditis, there will be shortness of breath. You can see, and an ECG will be very suggestive in that case. For pneumothorax, again, there should be a history of there may be a history of trauma, there may be a history of bacterial infection prior, but again, it should be suggestive in history, but history is not suggestive here. Myocardial infarction, it's not a retrosternal burning pain like the patient is there and it's worsened after eating. Again, history is not suggestive of MI. So we'll go for that. Which of the following is the most accurate test to diagnose GERD? So remember, when history is not very well suggestive, most of the time GERD is suggestive based on the history alone. But when history is not suggestive, we will go for which accurate test?
24 hours.
24 hours pH monitoring. Yes. Okay. Then I think for this one, we have to go for the theory first. Then we have peptic ulcer disease, 133. We'll quickly go to this one. Peptic ulcer disease. So peptic ulcer disease refers to both. It may be duodenal ulcer, it may be gastric ulcer, but however, both of them we should have to go for this endoscopy because that is the only key for the diagnosis for this peptic ulcer disease. And most commonly, its history will be very suggestive in order to make a peptic ulcer. The patient must say that he is taking NSAIDs maybe for so long because of any joint pain or knee pain or maybe any backache or maybe any he's used to of taking this painkiller medication. There's something in the history which is going to be very suggestive that the patient is taking this NSAIDs for as a for analgesic. So always think about this one. And then of course H. pylori infection is there. Alcohol and tobacco do not cause ulcers. They delay healing of ulcers. So directly, the cause will not be alcohol. The cause will not be tobacco. They actually progress. They actually increase the progression of the disease. They delay the healing of the ulcers. So NSAIDs produce more bleeding as compared to pain. So most likely, most common cause will be H. pylori and NSAID, and most likely in our society we have this NSAID because our patients they do self medication a lot. So peptic ulcer disease present with recurrent episodes of epigastric pain, you can see. So only diagnosis of this duodenal ulcer and gastric ulcer we can ask on history basis. Say for example, if the patient says that I'm having pain, but that pain is actually improved with eating, then you can always think about duodenal ulcer. And the patient is saying that then whenever I am just started eating, the pain starts. So just, the pain start just after starting eating, it means that it has a gastric, because just now the stomach received and stomach has ulcer, it started paining. But for the duodenal ulcer, what will happen? Because it will take some time. So once it receive all the food, it will take some time, because gastrum at least contain food for 3 to 4 hours. So once after 3 to 4 hours, when the food gets into the duodenum, then the duodenal pain starts. So it will take time. That's why the patient says usually after eating we are relieved, but it's not actually relieved. After some time they are going to have pain again. But time will be delayed, 3 to 4 hours delayed. So upper endoscopy, the most accurate test will be upper endoscopy. You will see this one. Now, the best initial treatment, always remember this one here for your recall point of view. We will always consider PPI, this proton pump inhibitors, but proton pump inhibitors alone are not very effective. Whenever there is H. pylori infection, we have to give in combination, the combination therapy of this for H. pylori infection. PPI you are going to combine with clarithromycin and amoxicillin. This is a very important thing. Alone PPI is effective, no doubt. But whenever there is documented H. pylori infection based on the endoscopy result, you will always go for PPI with clarithromycin and amoxicillin. We will just go for this one. Okay, now the question says, a 40-year-old man is evaluated in the emergency department for several episodes of hematemesis. He has no previous similar episodes. His history is unremarkable. He takes no medication. There is no jaundice or other signs of chronic liver disease. This is very important in history point of view. There is no jaundice. There is no CLD, because whenever there is hematemesis, first thing which comes to your mind, what is that? That is esophageal varices, maybe the bleeding of varicose bleeding always comes in our mind. So whenever the question says there is no signs of CLD, there is no jaundice, so this varicose bleeding should be excluded here. Now there is abdominal examination reveals no tenderness, guarding or rebound. Blood pressure is this one. Okay, again in the history, the patient just came in the emergency department for several episodes of hematemesis. Say, for example, in order to make a diagnosis, hematemesis may be because of the Mallory-Weiss tear also. But how you're going to differentiate that one? Based on the history. Again, history is very important. Say, for example, the patient says to you that I was having a severe cough, and just after coughing, I have this hematemesis. So you can think of, okay, there's a retching, there's a vomiting, there's a cough. Based on that, there will be a tear. The tear is actually Mallory-Weiss tear, but it only happened once. It cannot be a persistent episode of hematemesis. So there will be a severe retching, severe vomiting, severe coughing, and after that episode, the hematemesis is there. So think about Mallory-Weiss tear. Something in the history, if the patient says to you that he's having this hematemesis soon after retching, soon after vomiting, soon after a heavy cough. Okay, so here, if we just look at the blood pressure, it's on the lower side, heart rate, it's on higher side. Otherwise, hemoglobin is low. Of course, hematemesis is there. And then platelet count. Again, very important to look for the platelet count. Whenever hematemesis is there, you have to have many differentials in your mind. First differential, always when you see hematemesis case, think about esophageal varices. Think about varicose bleeding. You have to rule out varicose bleeding based on some liver infection, based on CLD, based on alcoholic intake of the patient. And whenever there is alcoholic intake, platelet count will always be low.
Dr. Hira,
Yes,
hematemesis is blood and vomiting, exactly.
Blood and vomiting. Yes, dear. Yes. So whenever there is blood and vomiting, you have to have so many differentials in your mind, and then you will start excluding them one by one. So say, for example, you will check for the history if the patient is alcoholic. Always check if there is alcohol history, because alcohol is the one which is the main cause of CLD, right? And CLD is the main cause of varicose bleeding. So thereby you can easily exclude. If the patient is not alcoholic, if there is no derangement in the liver function test, it means that if there is no jaundice, it means that there is nothing related to varices. That is excluded. Second thing, for hematemesis comes Mallory-Weiss always. So again, you will ask in the history, you will check for the history if the patient is having severe retching, vomiting, and then there is the episode of hematemesis, but it occurs only once. The patient always landed up once after having this vomiting. That it's not going to be repeated very much. The third thing is that too much coughing, too much cough, but it's a very sudden explosive cough. Suddenly the patient starts, ended up in explosive cough. That's the retching. Yeah, he is having some irritation in throat and then explosive cough. That is retching.
Okay, my children always cough and then vomit.
It's okay. That is for kids. It's okay, no problem. But there should be no hematemesis. There should be no blood in the sputum. That you have to look for. Yeah. Then okay. Now again, these questions whenever hematemesis, they always look for platelets count and prothrombin time. If platelet count is low, if it's normal, forget about any liver pathology, forget about any variceal bleeding, forget about any biliary Weis-Starr or any thrombocytopenic disorder. It can only be ulcer. It can only be peptic ulcer. Why? Because platelet count always lower in case of CLD patient, in case those who are having this alcohol intake, in history of alcohol intake. You will always see low platelet count. But if there is hematemesis and platelet count is normal, you should not worry about those things. And again, prothrombin time will be increased. Here, prothrombin time is normal. See, LFTs are normal, so there is no chance of variceal bleeding at all. So again, creatinine is all normal. Which of the following is the most likely cause? So it may be erosive gastritis, but erosive gastritis, usually they are not presenting with the hematemesis. So we cannot choose erosive gastritis based on the symptoms. Esophageal varices, we will never choose this one. Why? Because the patient has no history of CLD, no jaundice, no platelet dysfunctioning, no prothrombin time dysfunction. See, investigation will come late. First is presentation. In history, there is no alcohol. In history, there is no CLD. In history, there is no liver function derangement. Forget about esophageal varices. Biliary Weis-Starr, again, suggestive in terms of history. There is no history of retching, or there is no history of something, after having something explosive cough and then hematemesis. Nothing like that in the history. So this one is ruled out. So this
is hematemesis after severe coughing.
It's a tear. It's a tear in the, especially in the intima of the esophagus, that leads to hematemesis. That leads to this.
That occurs after severe cough.
Severe cough. There will be a severe cough, and then the intima of the esophagus, it will tear. There will be a tear, but obvious tear in the intima, and then you will see from there the arteries started bleeding, and the blood came from those arteries. Because of
not only erosive gastritis, there must be history of some ingestion, some
yeah. For erosive gastritis, it's still gastritis. It's not converted into ulcer yet. See, for becoming an ulcer, there are stages, right? First, there is a little irritation, mild swelling, then moderate swelling. You can say, okay, it's a gastritis, and then it leads to ulcer. Ulcer it's something wound, right? That is too much beyond inflammation, beyond gastritis. Yes, so gastritis usually don't present with hematemesis, yeah. But gastritis usually presents with the burning,
gastritis is infection and inflammation, and ulcer is already wound.
Already, it's a next stage. It's a next stage, just like ischemia, and then ischemia leads to infarction. Yes, dear.
Why is platelet count is decreasing?
Here, the platelet count is normal, but whenever it's a case of variceal bleeding, the history of CLD is there, the history of derangement liver enzymes. The alcohol is the main reason for decreasing platelet count. So here it's not there. No? So always when you are discriminating this variceal bleeding from the peptic ulcer bleeding, so always think about this one, that the cause is liver derangement enzyme, and the cause is alcohol. The basic cause is alcohol. Alcohol is the one which acts on the platelet, and platelet formation. It actually decreases the amount of megablast, which are the megakaryocytes. They are the platelet forming cells. So they actually thereby decreasing the whole phenomena of making platelets, the whole metabolism of platelet, converting of megablast into megakaryocyte, and again this into mature platelets. So it's a pathophysiology actually related to alcohol intake, which is the main causative agent of CLD or main causative agent of variceal bleeding. But here in this case, peptic ulcer, there is nothing related to platelet, right? Platelet will be normal because it's a ulcer. It's a acidic secretion from the stomach content, which actually utilizes the own protein of the stomach and thereby creating the wound in the stomach. That is ulcer actually, right? The mucous lining of the stomach gets thinner and thinner and thinner, and our own stomach mucosa is prone to HCl. Stomach is releasing pepsin, trypsin, amylase, lipase. You remember the whole physiology of the stomach? They are secreting enzymes, they are secreting HCl, too much
Here
HCl.
all the labs are normal.
Here everything is normal, yes. Except that you will see the hematemesis here. Okay. The next question, which of the following is considered to be the most accurate test for diagnosing peptic ulcer? It's a straight away question. Most accurate test, what will be your answer? Remember, most accurate? You have to go for endoscopy. No, dear, most accurate. You will see the ulcer by your own naked eyes, right?
Okay.
Endoscopy. Okay, which of the following?
Most accurate will not biopsy. Confirmatory will be biopsy. Most accurate will be biopsy.
Yeah, but if you are asking for the test, see, biopsy you will take and you will see H. pylori in that one. Nah? But if you are just asking for the diagnostic purpose, then always you will go for the endoscopy, and during endoscopy you will take biopsy, and then you will go for the H. pylori testing. So it's a step by step. But
No,
the
the
thing will be
biopsy and endoscopy both. Biopsy or endoscopy both are done for diagnosing.
Yes, both are. But you have to.
We are saying about the most accurate. The most accurate will be the final confirmatory accurate will be the biopsy.
Yeah, but see again biopsy is a very broad term. Now you can see sometimes you have to choose in this way that what you're going to, who is going to add more value. Do you think biopsy is the one which you are getting, or first you have to go for the endoscopy and then you will take biopsy? Which is going to be the best one? Think in that way. Now you cannot choose biopsy as the most accurate here. They are asking for the most accurate test. So test will be endoscopy, and the therapeutic, diagnostic plus therapeutic will be biopsy.
No, the
Because on biopsy you will get the result.
Biopsy is also a test, no?
It's also a test, but you cannot do biopsy without endoscopy. So what is the most accurate thing you will do in order to diagnose? You will start with endoscopy and then you will take biopsy.
Okay. Most.
Yes, more. Yeah. The confirmatory will be the biopsy. If they're asking for the confirmatory
diagnosing.
test, yeah, if they're asking for the confirmatory test, see, then you can say,
okay, this is the question. The question is tricky. It's saying a most accurate test for diagnosing.
Dr. Hira, I think a biopsy is the most accurate test for H. pylori.
Yes. So again, see, you're holding the ear from your left hand, or just turning around from the right side. It means the same thing. Biopsy you will do, and you will go for the testing, and you will see H. pylori in that. Okay.
Yeah. So if the question says the diagnosing H. pylori, I think then the answer should be biopsy. But here it is only asking for PUD, so the answer should be upper endoscopy.
Yeah, you can say in this way also. Yeah.
But it needs to be confirmed. Dr. Hira, आप confirm करके बताएं हमें कल.
See, we will just look for the MTB. MTB it's the most clinical, clinical knowledge based guide for you. So if it says most accurate, then go for this most accurate. Fine for this one, peptic ulcer, where it's written. Peptic ulcer, this one, right? So peptic ulcer. Because I've already confirmed this.
No, you are working in a setup. You can go and ask the doctor what is the most.
No, dear. Sometimes working in a clinical setup and dealing with the guide is different. Here they are just doing urea blood test and they confirm, oh, it's a peptic ulcer disease. In OPD, no need for biopsy, nothing to check.
Yeah.
Only urea blood test, OPD setting, urea blood test, and you're done. You're diagnosed.
Yes. They only want to make us
theory and clinical practice. Theory and
you only want to judge us and make us confused and pagal.
Yes. It's okay. All right. We'll just I have seen somewhere here. Most accurate, you will see here. See, upper endoscopy most accurate test. always allows for intervention and biopsy. So you will go for this one, and then you will again proceed with this biopsy and everything. If you cannot find anything with your naked eye, you will not going to take the biopsy of that one. If you see something is there, then you will take the biopsy, and then you will go for the testing. So it's there.
Oh,
Okay.
okay.
Now, which of the following is the best treatment regimen for treating peptic ulcer disease? Now, they're asking for the best treatment, right? So, always consider you will not give PPI alone. Best treatment and the most commonly used treatment is PPI with antibiotic. And you remember those antibiotics, clarithromycin and amoxicillin.
Yes, public trust.
Okay. Okay, next one we'll go for, I think, this hemochromatosis. We'll just quickly go to the theory. 148. Someone is asking me that, checking in the MTB handouts is difficult. You just press Control F and write here whatever you want to search. So it will come here. Whenever you are searching something inside the PDF file, you can always click Control F. And then this finding window will come, and then you can just write anything here, and it will take you, because it's OCR. It can search along your, throughout your PDF file.
How to do this?
Say for example, if I want to search something inside this,
Okay. You have to press Control
and then F, A, B, C, D, E, G, F, F. Control F, and it will come like this. And then you will just type here peptic or something like that. It will take you there. Like this. Then you can just do next, where you want to go. So here we will go for 148. 133. No, 148. Okay, hemochromatosis, very clear-cut question. There will be too much iron inside the body, right? The cause may be anything, but most likely the cause is mutation in the gene, and the gene is C282Y gene. So if there is a mutated gene, there will be too much iron, and what you are ending up, you will be ending up in taking the blood from the patient. The only thing is there. So the only question which I've seen so far is they're always asking for what is the best treatment for this hemochromatosis. You have to always go for phlebotomy. You have to take patients' blood out from their body. So hemochromatosis, this is a genetic disorder. You will see the mutation in this gene, mostly happening in the old age patients. You will see some enzyme derangement also here. And whenever there is hemochromatosis, there will be too much iron inside the body, because for this one, you will see some dysfunction. The patient may be having this all skin darkening. The patient can be having cardiomegaly associated with this one. But these are all the associations. But most likely you will go for the iron studies. You will check iron will be increased. Most accurate test, if they are asking, go for the liver biopsy. There you will see increased amount of iron on histological basis. EKG, you will see the conduction defects, not very suggestive. Echocardiogram, not very suggestive. But best therapy is phlebotomy. You have to take patient's blood out from his body, just in order to decrease the iron amount. So just remember, for hemochromatosis, there will be too much iron. You have to take blood from your patient. Simple as that. So there is, I think, only one recall for this one. A 39-year-old man with asymptomatic hereditary hemochromatosis, the diagnosis is there with you, presented to the clinic for a checkup. Test result, alkaline phosphatase is 42, the normal is 39. So it's okay, it's in the normal range. Aminotransferase also, it's in the normal range. In the normal range. And then aspartate, again, it's in the normal range. Everything is normal. So here what you're going to do. Ferritin is raised, of course, iron will be raised. Which of the following is the most appropriate? He's a diagnosed case of hemochromatosis. So when you see the ferritin level is getting higher, you have to take his blood out. So there is no ambiguity in this one. You have to initiate regular therapeutic phlebotomy. So phlebotomy means you have to do the venipuncture, and you have to take the blood out from his body. That's the only thing. Now, which of the following tests is considered to be the best initial test for diagnosing hemochromatosis? Of course, you will always check iron, ferritin, iron studies. Best initial. But if they're asking you the most accurate test, what you will do?
Liver biopsy.
Liver biopsy, yeah.
And on EKG, there will be changes in echo. there will be-
Conduction defect. Yeah, there are, but it's not very suggestive. It's not very, it's not going to add anything, in your diagnosing a patient. If you're diagnosing for the first time.
No, we are discussing the options.
Yeah, yeah.
There will be
In EKG, you can see the conduction defects. Like there will be bradycardia. And for echocardiography, there will be hypertrophy.
hypertrophy.
Yes, yes. Okay. For the next one, we have to go for the theory first. Next is Crohn's disease. So Crohn's and this ulcerative colitis, they are actually a part of inflammatory bowel diseases. But here we are just emphasizing on Crohn's first. So page number 141. Okay, so inflammatory bowel disease is actually of two types. One is Crohn's disease, another one is ulcerative colitis. Presentation, again, for recall point of view, presentation is very important. Diarrhea, pain will be there. Think about celiac also. Think about irritable bowel syndrome also. You have to exclude one by one, always. So here, again, diarrhea is there. There will be abdominal pain. There will be diarrhea. There may be blood in stool. Melena can be there. And the overall hemoglobin count will be low. Anemia will be there. The patient is going to show you weight loss. Whenever there's irritable bowel syndrome, there is no weight loss. Celiac disease, sometimes you can find weight loss in early stages of life. But here in inflammatory bowel disease, you will always find weight loss, maybe a history of fever also. So think about abdominal pain, think about this diarrhea, think about weight loss. If three things are there, the diagnosis should be inflammatory bowel disease. Now, the site, on the basis of site, we will say it's a Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis. So we will see in both of these patients, there are some extra intestinal manifestation as well. So again, in this, this is very common recall, very common for as far as this Crohn's is concerned. There will be an ulcer on the shin, on the tibia, and that will lead to gangrene. Starting in this, that is considered to be the extra intestinal manifestation, because fever is there, infection is there, that will cause arthralgia, that will cause uveitis. In eyes, it can cause iritis. There may be skin infections. So these are extra intestinal manifestation, means outside the intestine what this disease can cause. It can cause this, especially this one, ulceration of the ulceration, especially on the shin, on the tibia. The risk of cancer associated with this one again is there. Both forms of IBD can lead to colon cancer. So screening is very important. Screening we should know about this one, like after 8 to 10 years of colonic involvement with colonoscopy every 1 to 2 years. So we have to do screening for the colon cancer every 1 to 2 years if there is long standing involvement of colon for about 8 to 10 years. We have to go for the screening for colon cancer. So site is important in order to differentiate Crohn's and ulcerative. So mostly they are not asking these questions, but yes, there is one recall where they are asking for fistula. So fistula and granulomas you will always find in Crohn's disease, because they are the skip lesions. The cells are going to necrose, cells are going to mixed up and matched up. They can form fistula, they can form granulomas. You will see. But here is in ulcerative colitis, there is no fistula, because this is only the inflammation. Inflammation is not going so much beyond in order to form a fistula. Fistula will be there when the cells necrose and they fuse together. When they fuse together, there will be a hole inside, and 2 or 3 things can mix up together and can form fistula. But that is nothing happening in ulcerative colitis. So most accurate test, you should remember this one. We have to see on our eyes. We have to check whether there is ulceration or not, whether fistula is there or not. So we'll go for endoscopy. So we'll just look for the questions. So a 38-year-old man with a history of chronic abdominal pain. So history is very suggestive. So look for the history carefully. Okay, a 38-year-old woman with a history of chronic abdominal pain and diarrhea develops tender red nodules on her shins, tibia. Extraintestinal manifestation is there. The findings are most consistent with which of the following? So abdominal pain is there, diarrhea is there, shin, tender red nodules. And right now it's tender red nodule. Later on it will convert it into gangrene. So we have to rule out here. So based on the history, you will say, for the celiac disease, there must be something related to gluten diet. There must be something related to diet. Patient. For diverticular diseases, diverticular, it's a fistula. There should be some histological evidences there. Irritable bowel syndrome cannot be associated with this shins and everything. It's only remain inside the intestine. It will not go beyond extra intestine. So it's a clear cut.
Crohn's disease.
Okay, which of the following tests is considered to be the most accurate test for inflammatory bowel diseases? So we'll go for most accurate test will be
Biopsy.
biopsy. Yes. Biopsy, no. Endoscopy. Most accurate. Again, the same thing like the previous one. You have to go for the endoscopy. You see by yourself, and then you will go for the biopsy if needed. The first is endoscopy.
Confusing.
Let me show you again.
No, they have told this, but it's confusing.
Yeah. But see, don't go for biopsy, until and unless it's asked you for the confirmatory test. Because when the word confirmatory is there, now always think about, extreme thing, like what will be the last resort. So only on the basis of biopsy you will say. But whenever they are asking for the diagnostic or therapeutic, consider
They are
endoscopy.
saying the
Consider the
most
first.
confirmatory.
Yeah. When the word confirmatory is there, then only choose.
No, they are saying most confirmatory.
Yeah.
No, how it will be? How the biopsy will be?
Biopsy is the
therapeutic.
biopsy is not the diagnostic test. Biopsy is the confirmatory test. When you are going to say something definitely, then you should go for the biopsy for the histological evidence. First you will go for the morphological evidence. Morphology, you will check the quality of the tissues by your own eye. Then you go for the histology. So step by step, right? First you always check the quality, and then like morphology, and then you go for the histology, like whether the changes in the cell is there or not. So for the confirmatory point of view, biopsy is okay. Biopsy is the one. But for the diagnostic point of view, when you are doing the morphological evaluation, you go for the endoscopy, right? You're getting me? So diagnostic and confirmatory, the two words should be in your mind always. Diagnostic plus sometimes diagnostic plus therapeutic also, when you do some intervention also. So in endoscopy, you do intervention also, right? You are taking sample. That is, taking a biopsy. So diagnostic plus therapeutic. Then like hysteroscopy or gynae, right? You're a gynec person, so you know about hysteroscopy. Hysteroscopy, you're taking diagnostic DSC, that is considered to be therapeutic also, right? Okay. Then the next one, we'll just quickly go through the theory. Okay, next we have celiac disease, 139. Celiac disease, it's an autoimmune disease, right? The patient is sensitive to which protein? Gluten. So there must be a clear-cut history for this one. Celiac disease, there should be, the patient is gluten sensitive, that's a protein. And it's because it's an autoimmune disease, it's immune malfunctioning, you have to go for the enzymes checking, you have to go for the antibody checking. So best initial test is anti-tissue transglutaminase, and patient is always presenting you with diarrhea. And in very early stages also. Very early stages, the patient can present, or sometime in late stages also when they started to taking this gluten diet, especially. So most accurate test will be most accurate test is small bowel biopsy, where you can see the flattening of the villi, where you can see there is no lymphoma. And other tests, you can always go for the antibody testing. But remember, the best initial test is anti-tissue transglutaminase, because that is the enzyme which is deficient here. And it actually causes the defect in the metabolism of gluten, and that will result in diarrhea. So if we just go for the question. We will see here a 25-year-old woman presented with episodic abdominal pain and altered bowel habits that have been present intermittently for the past year. The pain is crampy and moderate to severe. Defecation brings some relief, but she sometimes must pass several loose, watery stools before the pain resolves. She occasionally notes mucus in her stool and sometimes feels that evacuation is incomplete, even though she is unable to pass more stool. Her body weight is stable, abdominal examinations are normal. Which of the following is the most appropriate test to establish diagnosis? So here, the question is something like that, which is pointing us towards irritable bowel syndrome also, right? if you could just look for the question. But maybe in the answer choices, you can get to know, you can easily evaluate. So which of the following is the most? Helicobacter pylori. There is nothing related to Helicobacter pylori here. There is no nothing this epigastric pain or this dysphagia history. There is nothing like that. Thyroid function test. It has nothing related to here. Thyroid function test. Do you think if it's a hypothyroid, the patients should be complaining about too much constipation? There should be menstrual disorder as also. There must be fatigue or something like that. So history is not suggestive that we should go for the thyroid
But
function
there is
test.
diarrhea.
And what about yes? And CT abdomen?
But diarrhea could be suggestive for thyroid, no?
Yes, but only like say for example, diarrhea can, but which type, hypo, hyper? Then again, you have to go in that one. But again, only with the help of diarrhea, you cannot just say it's a hyperthyroid patient, right? There should be tremors, there should be palpitation, menstrual disorders, constipation. All these things have to be
They have
evaluated,
not.
right?
They have not given the option to hypo or hyper. They have only
Yes.
which will we do to
Yes.
confirm.
Yes, yes, yes. But thyroid function test, it's not pointing, right? Because
Yes.
here it's the crampy, here she's having abdominal pain, or most likely the bowel movement is so more related to the bowel thing. So you will always think about celiac disease testing. Why? Because of this all presentation. So look for the presentation. If celiac disease testing is there, and in order to rule out this irritable bowel syndrome, but for irritable bowel syndrome, we don't have anything. It's a diagnosis of exclusion based on the physical examination, based on the history. We don't have nothing significant in diagnostic point of view. We don't have any specific test for that. But for celiac, we do have tests. So we'll go for celiac disease testing. We'll go for anti-tissue transglutaminase testing in this case. Now, which of the following tests is the most accurate test for diagnosing celiac disease? Most accurate. If they're asking most accurate here, what you're going to do?
Biopsy.
Here we go for the biopsy.
Transglutaminase.
And anti-tissue is the initial test. The first thing should come in your mind is anti-tissue transglutaminase.
IgA anti-gliadin antibody.
IgA antibody and anti-endomycin antibody. These two are the other tests which can be a supportive test. Anyhow, these are the supportive tests. They're not going to give you any clue because it's not a proper autoimmune disorder. It's immune malfunction. So sometimes you will get antibodies, sometimes you will not get. So these are not supportive at all. Only small biopsy and tissue transglutaminase, two things. So the initial one, you will start with the tissue transglutaminase and you will end it up with the small biopsy where you have to see the flattening of the alveoli or you will see if there should be any granular lymphoma or no. So here the answer is small biopsy.
Again, here saying biopsy most accurate. There they were saying it's confusing.
See, here you don't have any other option rather than biopsy. Because one is initial one, those other tests are only the supportive tests.
No,
they are not going to give you any clue. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. But the previous questions they were saying the biopsy or the other.
So that is the thing which you have to consider in your exam as well, especially those who are sitting for USMLE exam. They are very into it, regarding this best initial and most accurate, because most of the questions are based on only this thing. What will be the best initial test? What will be the initial presentation of the symptoms? The later the patient presented with this one. If you solve this UL questions, this USMLE step 2 type questions. So, and in video lectures of also Dr. Conrad Fisher, he used to say, oh, you have to memorize only these things. What you're going to do first, what you're going to do at the last, what should be the most, what should be the more, best initial, only initial. You have to look for all these questions. But for DHA point of view, for MOH point of view, they're just asking for the best initial and most accurate. Mostly they're asking most accurate. Okay, so that's all for today. So inshallah, see you tomorrow. Thank you everyone for joining. Thank you. Allah Hafiz. I think that's the last topic, right?
We finished.
Allah Hafiz, thank you.
Allah Hafiz. Allah Hafiz.
Thank you, Allah Hafiz.
Thank you, Dr.